Hi, I'm Jonah, and this is a Learn to Play tutorial for El Condor Pasa. And this is a classic Peruvian song, and it's traditionally played on a zampona, which is a pan flute, which is a bunch of tubes all put together, or on a quena, which is a straight flute that you blow across the top. And both of those flutes have a real full, round, warm sound to them, just like our spirit flutes, and that's why I'm playing this on a spirit flute. Now, when I was learning to play this song, I really enjoyed learning all the dynamics that I could put into it and all the different ways it could be played. I was finding ways to play it real slow and soft and with kind of this round, slow sound to it, like a bird soaring on the wind, and like the condor soaring on the wind. And then it also can have this really big, full sound, like the rushing river coming down through the Andes. So I really enjoyed putting all those dynamics into kind of an improvisational version of the sound sample of the song, and you'll find that at the end of this video. Now, I think of this song as being kind of more of an intermediate level song, just because it's a longer song, and so there's a lot of parts to it. There's some cross fingerings, there's notes that some of you may not have played before. And there's some runs of notes that might take a little time to learn. Now, I'm calling it an intermediate song, but anybody can learn to play this. It's just going to take a little more time for a beginner. It's just going to take more time to get the fingerings and with the tempo and all the notes as they go together. But it's definitely doable. Now, I'm going to play through the song once as it's written in the sheet music. And then I'll go through a little introduction of how to use this tutorial. We'll go through the tutorial itself. And at the end, I have kind of more of an improvisational version that doesn't necessarily follow the sheet music exactly, but has like the fullness of the whole song. And that's one of the things I love about learning a song so completely, is that you can play it like the sheet music, but then you can also start putting your own flair into it and take it outside the sheet music itself and really put your heart into it. Now, the easiest way that I find to learn songs is to work through them phrase by phrase. Now, phrases are like sentences. You put a bunch of sentences together to build a story. In the same way, you put a bunch of phrases together to build a song. Essentially, each time you pause to take a breath, you've completed a phrase. And because in the music we've added these breath marks, you can easily see that the phrases begin and end at each of these breath marks. I've also noted the number of the phrases using these italicized numbers. Phrase 1, 2, and so on. As I walk through each phrase, I'll note anything that's unusual or particularly challenging in that phrase, and then I'll show you how to play it, and I'll play it at a really slow tempo. And at that point, I suggest pausing the video and working on that phrase until you have the fingerings and the rhythm pretty well down at that slow tempo, and then move on to the next phrase. Once you move through the whole song, I suggest going back to the beginning of the song and working through each phrase again. And each time you do that, your hands will memorize the fingerings a little bit more, and you'll memorize the rhythms a little bit more, and the song will get easier to play, and you can start bringing it up to tempo.
These are the notes that some of you may not have played before, so when you come to these notes in the song, have some patience with yourself. It may take a little time to learn the transitions from the note before it to this note and to the note after it. I'll also talk more about these transitions and notes as we come upon them in each phrase.
This is the sheet music for El Condor Pasa, and I want to go over an overview of the whole thing before I move into the individual phrases. So first of all, if you look here, this time signature is here, and this is in 2/4. So most of the music that we look at in this tutorial series is in 4/4. And what the top number indicates is how many beats there are per measure. And so it gives the feel of the music. So 2/4 is 1 2 1 2 1 2 1 2. It's very much of a march. It has that kind of feel to it. Where 4/4 is 1 2 3 4 1 2 3 4 1 2 3 4. So that has a little more of a dance feel to it, or more of a fluid motion feel to it, where the 2/4 has a very marching kind of a feel. So that kind of sets the overall feel of the way the song moves. Now the other thing I wanted to go over is actually moving through this sheet of music, the technical part of moving through this sheet of music, because there's a lot of repeat symbols and different endings, and there's a lot of going back and forth. And it's built this way or written this way in order to make it more concise, so it can just be two pieces of paper or 2 pages versus probably 6 or 8 pages if it was all written out. So let's walk through it. So from the beginning, you just start playing. And you're at phrase 1, phrase 2, phrase 3, phrase 4, and then when you get to the end of phrase 4 and you're moving into phrase 5 here, you see this symbol right here. And this is a repeat symbol. And this is saying, go back to where you see this symbol previously in the sheet of music to the next closest repeat symbol and start playing again from there. And where we see that is here. So we go back to the very beginning right here and we see this symbol, and then we start playing through it again. And now if you notice, phrase 1 is now phrase 5, and that's why there's 2 phrase numbers here. So phrase 1 is now phrase 5, and then we move into phrase 6, phrase 7, and phrase 8, and then we end up here again at where there's a repeat symbol. However, you notice this bracket here with the number 1. This was the first ending that we played, so we played that one already. So now the second time through, we move past that to the second ending here. And if you notice, this bracket with the number 2 is not closed on this side. It's open. And what the open side means here is that we just keep playing. And so on the second time through, you just keep moving through the music, and we're at phrase 9, phrase 10, and then when we get to the end of phrase 10 and we're moving into phrase 11, we again see a repeat symbol here, and with the bracket and the number 1. So this is our first ending, and then we go back to the next closest repeat symbol in the sheet of music. So when we look back, it's right here. So we move back to here, and then we keep playing. And this is the second time through, so this is now phrase 11, phrase 12. And when we get to the end of phrase 12 and moving into phrase 13, we skip the first ending here because we did this one already. And we move into the second ending with the open bracket, and then we keep playing through. So we're at phrase 13 and phrase 14. And then it seems like we're at the end of the song. However, if you notice these words here, this one says tu coda, and then this says DS with endings al coda. And DS stands for del sango, and that is it's Italian for a symbol. And what this DS with endings al coda is saying is go back to the del sango symbol, the DS symbol, and play until you reach the coda symbol. And when you reach this 2 coda, jump to the coda, which is here. So we play through the sheet of music.
we get to the DS with endings al coda, we jump back to the del sango symbol at the beginning of the song, at the beginning of the sheet music. We work through the whole sheet music again. And then when we get to this coda, 2 coda symbol here, we jump down to the coda symbol and then we would play on. But essentially that's the end of the song because there's nothing more after that. So that's how that ending works. And that's a way of consolidating. Instead of writing out the whole sheet of music again, they use this in order to say, hey, play through the whole sheet of music again. Now in the sound sample that I did at the beginning of this video tutorial, I only played through the sheet of music once. So I didn't follow the DS with endings al coda, just to make things a little more concise. But in the more improvisational style sound sample that is at the end of this video, I'd go through the whole sheet of music twice. And I actually really like going through the sheet of music twice because I found as I was learning it that the first time through I really wanted to play it softly and with a lot of soft smoothness to it. And then the second time through, I really wanted to add a lot of intensity into it. So I enjoyed being able to play through it twice. So that's an overview of how to move through this sheet of music using all the repeat symbols and the different endings and the DS with endings al coda. And hopefully that makes a lot of sense. And now let's look at the individual phrases and walk through them one by one. So this is the first phrase of El Condor Pasa. And right off, this song starts with this run of notes. And it's such a beautiful opening. And it's also a lot of notes to move through. And when it's up to tempo, it moves somewhat quickly. So what I would suggest in the beginning is to move through this without any tempo at all, just to move through all these notes. So let's look at the notes individually. So the main thing that I wanted to point out here with the notes is that there's some notes in here that some of you may not have played before, like this note here and this note here. Now this note requires some cross fingerings, meaning that you're opening some holes and closing while simultaneously closing other holes. So if you haven't worked with cross fingerings before, then you'll want to move through this sequence of notes really slowly and just go through it a bunch of times to teach your fingers the muscle memory and the actual physical part of moving through these notes. And that way, when you go to play through the actual phrase, your fingers will already have some idea of how to move from one note to the next. Now that's also true for this note here. Take some time to teach your fingers the muscle memory of closing that lowest hole without closing the one above it. Now once you are feeling comfortable with that, then I suggest starting to move through this whole phrase from beginning to end without any tempo. Just start walking through it from the beginning to the end. And that way you can start teaching, kind of memorizing this sequence of notes, the phrase itself. And then once you're feeling comfortable with that, add a really slow tempo. Slow like 1, 2, 1, 2, 1, 2. So something really slow like that, or even slower if you need to. Now when looking at the rhythm of this phrase, it's important to notice that this first note of the phrase starts on the other side of the measure, and it's an eighth note. So it actually starts on the offbeat. So it's starting on the 2 and. So if I was to count from the very beginning, I would go 1 and 2 and that would be my first note right here. So it would sound like and 1 and 2 and 1 and 2 and 1, 2. So that's how you would count this phrase. So just note that when you're starting this phrase, you're starting on the offbeat. And that happens quite a bit in this music. there's quite a bit of starting on the offbeat. So it's helpful to get the feel of what that feels like, and also understand like how to count it out, so you can count it and really understand the feeling of it by using the counting to gain that feel. This is the second phrase, and it's a short little phrase. And I separated it out as its own phrase because I tend to naturally take a breath when there's a rest for a whole beat, like this rest here. It's called a quarter rest, but it's actually a rest for, it's one whole beat. And so I just naturally take a breath there, so it's natural to make this its own phrase for me. If you want to combine phrases 1 and 2, that makes a lot of sense. So that just depends on your own style. Now, the main thing to look at in this phrase is that these notes here are over the octave notes. And so if you haven't played notes that are over the octave into the higher register on your flute, then you might need to learn how to get your flute to pop up into that higher register. And usually that takes a more poignant, precise, or kind of a hard tonguing, which is called staccato tonguing. And it sounds like ta ta versus ta 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 ta. That ta ta, the second one, is a real soft tonguing, and this would be a hard tonguing, ta ta ta. And you kind of use that to throw a blast of air, a quick blast of air into the flute to pop it up into the higher register. And it really depends on the flute as to how hard you have to do that. So play with that if you haven't played with over the octave notes before. This is the third phrase, and here again we see this over the octave note. So again, working with that to teach yourself the tonguing necessary for your specific flute, how hard you need to tongue it to jump it up over the octave, but also working with your fingering to teach your fingers the muscle memory to catch this fingering pattern, which is different than any of the other fingering patterns. So that might be a new note for you in that respect as well. And there's also these notes, which might be a new note for some of you as well. And if they are, again, there's cross fingering associated with it, moving into those notes and moving out of those notes. So you'll want to teach your fingers the muscle memory of how to make those cross fingerings. Now, when looking at the rhythm of this phrase, it's pretty straightforward in the beginning. It's eighth notes, holding notes for half a beat, 2 beats, and then these are all held for half a beat. So these are pretty straightforward rhythms. And then you get to this last measure, this last part of the phrase, where you have a dotted eighth note, a 16th note, and then a quarter note. So a dotted eighth note is held for 3/4 of a beat, and then a 16th note is held for 1/4 of a beat, and then you have the quarter note, which is held for a whole beat. So addressing the quarter note, the reason that I even bring that part into it is I was finding as I was learning the song that I kept wanting to hold that quarter note for a half note for 2 beats. Because of the coming off of these half notes in phrase 2 and the beginning of phrase 3, I just had this natural tendency to want to hold that for 2 beats. So keep that in mind as you're learning this, to hold that for 1 beat. Now, when it comes to this dotted 8th note and the 16th note, how do we learn what that feels like, that rhythm? So the best way to learn how that rhythm feels like is to count it out. And so when we talk about 8th notes, we talk about counting them using the word and to cut up the beat. So you would have for quarter notes, you'd have 1, 2, 1, 2. For 8th notes, you'd have 1 and 2 and 1 and 2 and. Now when we do 16th notes, we say 1E and a 2E and a 1E and a 2E and a 1E and a 2E and a 1E and a 2E and a. And that's how we count out 16th notes. So if we're going to count out this measure, the way that it's counted out would be you'd hold this dotted eighth note for 1 E and then the 16th note, 2 would be this quarter note. So 1 E and 2. 1 E and 2. So if I start on the measure before it, so if I start here, the first half a beat is a rest, because this is a eighth note rest. And so we go 1 and 2 and 1 E and 2. And then if I count it and then I clap on the notes, it sounds like this. 1 and 2 and 1 E and 2. Again, 1 and 2 and 1 E and 2. So doing it like that a bunch, you can start getting a feel for it. At different tempos, you can do it at a really slow tempo and then start bringing it up to faster and faster tempo. And then once you start getting kind of a feel of it in your body, that's why the clapping is really helpful, because you get a feel for it in your body. Then bring the flute into it and just play on one note, and then move through and count in your head, and then play the rhythm out. It sounds like this. And then up to tempo, it would sound like this. Now this rhythm is used a lot in this song, so it's worth taking some time to really learn the feel of this rhythm. And what I find is it's best if I learn it in my body, so that I don't need to count it as I'm moving through the song. I can actually just feel it as I'm moving through the song. This is phrase 4, and it's very similar to phrase 3. It's different, but it's very similar. You're working with the similar notes and a similar rhythm. Now, what I found the most challenging here is to hold this first note for a whole beat. I kept wanting to hold it for a half a beat. And so make sure to hold that for a whole beat and then move into the rest of the phrase. So now we're moving into phrase 5, which starts here with this measure. So we play this quarter rest, which gets 1 beat. And then we play this eighth rest, which gets a half a beat. And then we start here with this eighth note on the off beat. And then we move to this, we see this repeat symbol. So then we go back to the very beginning of the song, because that's where the other side of this repeat symbol is, right here. And then we play through the rest of phrase 5. So phrase 5 is exactly the same as phrase 1. Phrase 6 is phrase 2. Phrase 7 is phrase 3. Phrase 8 is phrase 4. So to save time in the tutorial, I'm not going to talk about all those phrases again. And we're going to move on to phrase 9. So as you come out of phrase 8 here, we've played through this first ending. So we skip the first ending and we move into the second ending here. And this is phrase 9. So phrase 9 has a lot of odd rhythms, and there's a lot of fingering changes too. It's quite a run here of fingering changes. So what I would suggest is to first work with the rhythm and make sure you hold this note, this dotted quarter note, for 1.5 beats. And then you're playing this eighth note, and then you're moving into this run of dotted eighth notes and 16th notes. And the combination really gives it's a very specific feel to this whole phrase, and I really enjoy the feel of this phrase. It took me a while to feel it in my body so that I didn't have to count it out continually, and once I could feel it in my body, and then I could concentrate more on the fingering changes. So I'd suggest doing like we did earlier, where you count out the rhythm, clap out the rhythm, and then play out the rhythm on the flute on one note to start getting the feel for it in your body. This is phrase 10, and phrase 10 is pretty straightforward. You have this note here, which some of you may not have played before. That's that new note. And then otherwise, it's just a matter of playing through this section. And I kept finding myself wanting to hold this eighth note here as a dotted eighth note for 3/4 of a beat, and then holding this one for a 16th note, because we just came off of this run of those dotted eighth note, 16th note combinations. So I just had to be really aware and train myself to play these as eighth notes. So coming out of phrase 10, we're moving into phrase 11, which finds us under this number 1 bracket here. So this is the beginning of phrase 11, and so we play this quarter rest and this eighth rest, and we play this eighth note, and then we hit this repeat symbol, which takes us back to phrase 9, which is now phrase 11. And then we play forward from there. So phrase 11 is phrase 9, and phrase 12 is phrase 10. So I'm not going to go over those again because we just went over those. And then, so now we'll move into phrase 13. So as we come off of phrase 12, we skip the first ending because we went through that one already, and we move on to the second ending here. And so now we're here in phrase 13. And phrase 13 is actually exactly the same as the second part of phrase 3 and 7. So you've played this before, and you'll recognize it as that second part of phrase 3 and 7. And it kind of brings back the beginning of the song into the end of the song, and it ties the two together really nicely. And as I played it, my ear remembered it, and it has this really nice feeling of tying the whole thing together. And now we're at phrase 14, or the last phrase of the song. And at first I wasn't quite clear about this ending, where it becomes really simple here. It's just this quarter note and this half note and this other quarter note and this other half note. But as I played it more and more, I found that this ending really pulls the whole thing together and gives a real feeling of finality. Now, like I talked about in the beginning of this tutorial, on the first time through the song, you end up hitting this DS with endings al coda. And the DS stands for del segno. I think that's how you say it, something like that, the pronunciation. And that is a little symbol, and that little symbol looks like this right here at the very beginning of the song. So when we are here at the end of the song and we get to this DS with endings al coda, we go back to the DS all the way to the beginning of the song. We play through the whole song again. And then the endings al coda part with endings al coda, that means when we get back to this symbol here, which is a coda, and this says it says to coda. So you're going to go to the coda, and the coda is right here. And essentially, after the coda, it's just a rest. So you end up just finishing the song here at this half note.